Hello. So I'm going to do some CPD on marking assessments, and marking assessments in maths is the kind of main focus. So I'm going to put a disclaimer before I start. The purpose of this presentation is not to provide CPD on how someone can mark exactly like a trained examiner will. Okay, that's not the purpose of the presentation. I don't have that expertise, and that expertise is not necessary for every teacher to be effective at marking assessments. That is something that some people have, a skill they have, and it's a skill they can share, but it is not necessary for everyone to have the full skills of a qualified examiner. I'm going to be including quotes and extracts that have been taken from different examining boards and some discussions I've had with some examiners. But the general personal interpretation that I'm putting across is meant to provide basic CPD for inexperienced markers and thoughts for middle leaders and those who set exam papers. Okay, so a lot of what I'm saying is a matter of, I suppose, personal opinion and the norms that I try and put in place in my own school. I also want to note that exam boards vary. Even within the same board, sometimes different marks are given at GCSE and A-level, and sometimes from year to year there are changes in the way exams are marked. Sometimes you have a 4-mark question and you see the same question the next year and it's 3 marks. So there is varying there, and the exam boards differ, but there's a set of principles here that, based upon, I suppose, my opinions as well, they will hopefully give some guidance or some food for thought, but they are not meant to be a decisive measure of what is right and wrong. There will be probably things that I talk about that you will agree with and things that you will disagree with, and that is absolutely perfect. So I pose the first question: what is the purpose of the assessment that's going on? And this could be an assessment at the end of year 7 exams, or the end of year 10 exams, or year 11 mock exams. And I know some schools even do assessments at Christmas time and Easter time as well, which are quite chunky. So what is the purpose of that assessment, and what are the results going to be used for? And I think those two questions should dictate very much as to what kind of things we do when we think about what assessment and what the department wants. One of the key factors, and I hope that's always a key factor, is to give the students feedback of how to improve. Even year 11 mock exams, that's still the main driving force. I know we're very interested in the data and what it means to us, but we want the students to improve. And if what we do doesn't fulfill that purpose, then we need to think about doing something differently. Again, identifying students or groups of students who may need something different, that's very, very important for any assessments. But also the school will have processes: report writing, setting, deciding tier of entry for exams, even comparing classes, value-added performance management. All those things do come into how assessments are sometimes used as well. So all of those are questions, but as we know, some assessments are used for different purposes. If I'm setting my year 11s a past paper for homework, the way I mark that will be very different to a year 11 mock exam, and we should weigh those things in, and also remember that teacher time is valuable and it should be used to the greatest extent it can be. I think there's a really big theme that I'm going to hopefully put across, and that is consistency. We want consistency and we want it to have impact. I would strongly argue that even a GCSE paper, if all 3 papers are being done in year 11 in, say, February, when mock exams often are, that the consistency with how the department marks it is more important to some degree than, say, if they were all given to an external exam body to mark. It's that the department are all singing from the same hymn book, and quite often the easiest kind of baseline to take as a department is what examination board norms would be anyway, to follow the mark schemes and the style of mark schemes that the examining board give. But the underlying thing is consistency. And if we ever want to deviate a little bit from how an examining board may work, then we should hold the right to do that, especially if it aids our students to have more impact on them. So how can this consistency be achieved? I think it's three things really. We need a mark scheme, and it needs to be a detailed mark scheme. Unless you're marking all the papers yourself and nobody else is marking the same thing, it's not okay just to have the answers written down on a piece of paper and expect everyone to make their own mind up. I think a massive part of the consistency is that dialogue, with somebody taking the lead as well. And that person who takes the lead doesn't necessarily need to be the head of department or the second in department. I strongly believe it can be shared around, and relatively inexperienced teachers could be in charge of a paper, as long as they're having that dialogue with the people around them. It can be a really good growing experience to be talking with everyone and engaging with the department on whether or not a student should get a mark for this question, what are the misconceptions they're having, what kind of feedback, what kind of things should we write, and finally moderation. Moderation should take place thoroughly with every high-stake examination, perhaps just 4 or 5 papers being taken from a sample. And if we want these things to be done well, time should be given. Deadlines for marking shouldn't be 3 or 4 days after the exam's been done. We want it done well, and there needs to be a window which allows that to be done well and allows things like moderation to occur. Okay, I've chosen some questions here where I would deviate from the Edexcel GCSE mark schemes because I feel that serves our students better, and I will talk about why. So the first one, we would want to solve the equation. Now, if it just said solve the equation and the student came up with the answer of, oh, it's half or 0.5 and just wrote that down, more than likely in a GCSE mark scheme, unless there was some specification that they must show their method, they would be given full marks. But for our Year 7s, I really want to see that they can develop their algebra. I want to see that they know the algebraic steps to make, and I want to see that they can do that well, and that's part of the assessment. So I wouldn't actually phrase a question like that anyway. I would say showing every step of your working, and I would award 0 marks if the method was not exactly as I wanted it to be. That may not be the same though for a GCSE paper. But it's okay if it serves the purpose of the department and the needs of the students. I feel quite strongly that we shouldn't mark something right for students and give it back to them if actually it's not what we want them to do, it's not what we expect them to do. And sometimes I kind of take the strand that rather than try and be very lenient and try and, I suppose, always just give them the mark regardless of whether they've truly deserved it. If it was explained why the scatter graph cannot be used for large values, for example, say it was outside of there, I want them to use the word extrapolation. I've taught the word in class, I've said learn the word. More than likely a GCSE exam would accept some level of waffle in the answer. And that waffle, I feel, by ticking on a GCSE student's work kind of gives them the viewpoint that if you don't revise work clearly and you don't revise the correct mathematical terminology, it's okay. And again, comparing two box plots, I will give them a precise formula that I want them to learn, comparing the medians and comparing the interquartile ranges and making sure that gives them some kind of clarity. So I wouldn't necessarily follow a GCSE mark scheme perfectly for those, and I would probably, but more than likely it wouldn't affect the total of the marks by more than 2 or 3. But it would be consistent across the department, and that's kind of part of the message, keeping consistent, keeping things clear. Kind of going to a typical GCSE mark scheme now, what some of the marks mean and what they're there for, and this is really for perhaps people who haven't seen them before, who are starting off their teaching career. So a method mark, so it's speaking of an attempt to apply a method. And that should generate the method mark. It's an attempt. There is some level of ambiguity, and a moderator may sometimes need to be the person who says, oh, I would give that mark or I wouldn't give that mark, and it doesn't really matter as long as it's consistent across the department. Method marks are usually follow through marks. Okay, so they usually follow through from one bit of working to the next, so you don't necessarily need correct answers throughout. If there's a lot of method marks, however, an early mistake may make the idea for the attempt for a correct method slightly more ambiguous. So quite often, if somebody makes a very early mistake, it might be quite hard to award some latter method marks, but by route of law they should, which kind of brings the idea, sometimes it says the method mark and it says dep afterwards, so that depends on the previous bit of working. So if they haven't got the previous bit of working right, they can't get the next method mark. And as a general principle for those setting questions, if there's an early slip in a question, the method mark shouldn't be impacted too much overall, and usually if I was setting an exam, I would kind of say that an early slip in a question should perhaps make an effect of 1 or 2 marks, but if it's a 5 or 6 mark question, you wouldn't want an early slip to kind of create the loss of all 5 or 6 things. There have been examples, especially in A-level questions, where it's quite hard to award latter marks with an early slip. Perhaps that's sometimes a failure of the exam setter, if that is the case, but you don't want early slips to mean too many marks are lost. One is an accuracy mark, which isn't the same as an answer mark. An accuracy mark, it's awarded for correct method or process, and if no method or process is seen, then full marks for the question are implied, but see the individual mark schemes for more details. So quite often the accuracy mark is given if the answer is fully correct, but you do have to look at the mark schemes for that. If there are M and A marks, the marker should check the method does support the final answer. Quite often it has A and then it has the abbreviation CAO after, which stands for correct answer only, but this is not always the case. A correct answer may not award any marks at all. You might have the answer right, but actually you can't get any marks for the question, and there are cases where that does happen. So the next one is B, is an unconditional accuracy mark. Okay, so for these, the marker doesn't need to look at the method at all. You can just award those if you've seen something. Quite often if you want a particular word, that comes up, or if you're marking graph work and you need to see particular features of that graph, but those are the ones which are actually more answer marks rather than accuracy, because if you see that, you can give the B mark. So communication marks, these are often quite hard to decide, and I always find within my department this is where more moderation needs to be done, because that communication is somewhat subjective, I suppose. So the marker should look at the intention of what the student is trying to communicate. Additional notes do need to come from the department, and sometimes the communication mark does come as a follow-through, so they could have something incorrect earlier on, and that incorrect thing they're using, say, to make a comparison later, and they can still get that mark. Sometimes that's marked with C with the FT follow-through afterwards, but you really do need to moderate those questions perhaps more than any, because what people accept and what people's interpretation of what a student's trying to communicate does differ. And sometimes when we know the students as well, that actually gives us a sense of bias to some of the questions. So the next type of mark I'm going to talk about is process marks. These are fairly unique to Edexcel, I believe, and they're fairly new. in many ways, they behave just like method marks. And if I was setting an exam for a year group lower down in the school, and I was making the mark scheme, I would probably put method marks in instead of process marks, just because people understand them better. But there are small differences. So we're looking for orderly and logical presentation. One of the chief examiners said as the kind of feedback that was of key significance. Orderly and logical presentation comes in here, and quite often a lost process mark earlier on sometimes means more process marks are lost as we move through. These are best looked at through an example, so I'm going to show you an example. So I'll give you a second to digest this. There are 495 coins in a bottle, a third of £1, 124 of 50p coins. Work out the total value of all the coins. So it's 4 marks, and the first 3 are process marks. Okay, and so what the person does, or what an example here that's talked about, is if somebody writes down 495 divided by 3 and they get it wrong as 145, the fact that they've written down the 495 divided by 3 gives them that process mark. Now they can use that process mark in the next part of the question by doing the subtraction, and then they get the 2 process marks to start off with. If they had just written down 145 and done it in their head, they would actually lose 2 process marks here, because they wouldn't be able to get the second process mark if the first one isn't in place. Whereas with a method mark, they probably would get that second one. And one of the things that I try and encourage with our students, and perhaps we mark these ones quite harshly, is that they write down what they're doing. They write down in words, say if they're trying to find the area of a particular shape, that they say the area of this shape is such and such, and that kind of shows that the process is correct. But largely these behave as method marks, and I really think that departmental moderation is more important than ever on questions like this, which could perhaps be a little divisive. As long as everyone's doing the same thing, then you'll get a set of outcomes at the end that's consistent, and with those outcomes it can give the messages the student needs and allow the department to use that information in whatever way it sees fit. But if people mark them differently, that's where the problem is going to come. So here really is, and I apologise for putting so much on the slides, but these, especially for new examiners, can be a little bit intimidating when people on their mark schemes use abbreviations. So these are, maybe you want to take a screenshot of this page if you're there, but these are at the beginning of most exam papers, so you can easily pick them up. So OE or equivalent, so if somebody writes a fraction down and they write 2/4 and really it's a half, OE means they will get that. Correct answer only, CAO, and that's a really nice when you're a marker, because you can just look out for that correct answer only if they've not got that answer. It's not their follow through. We've already spoken about that. Sometimes, particularly at A level, we use that symbol. It's a bit like a square root symbol. Without the vinculum on top, it's just a little line, and I put an example of that there. SC is special case. Sometimes if somebody goes wrong quite early in a question, and it's perhaps a common mistake, a whole separate mark scheme is made up for that eventuality, and that's a special case, and look out for those at the bottom of mark schemes sometimes. DEP, sometimes that's just D ... on mark schemes, but that depends on the previous mark. So if they get the previous mark wrong, they can't get the second one. It's particularly for method marks. That makes marking quite a bit easier, and if you're setting your own mark schemes, especially if they're not big mark questions, you might want to make the second method mark dependent on the first. Independent, it's the opposite. It doesn't make any difference what the previous one is. You're looking out for that particular thing. For some questions, there's just like, say, to find the area of a segment, you're looking to find the area of the triangle and the area of your sector and then subtract them, and whether or not you do one first or the other one first, they're completely independent of each other, so those two method marks don't need to be done in an order. An answer which rounds to, lots of mark schemes have that in, basically because rounding marks are not going to feature everywhere in the paper. So if you have a correct answer that rounds to something, then the mark scheme generally allows it. And then ignore subsequent working, especially if you've got say if there's fractions and they don't need to be simplified, or at A level, sometimes in calculus questions you might have, say, x to the minus 2/3, and somebody might go further and say, oh, that's 1 over the square root of x cubed, and we would ignore that if that wasn't something that we needed in the mark scheme. So ignore subsequent. These are perhaps less commonly featuring, at least they're not ones that I see as much, but they are from some other exam boards. So benefit of the doubt, sometimes we're supposed to mark positively, but if you're trying to communicate to somebody who might moderate your paper why you've given a mark for that, that might be what you do. An omission sign shows that something's missed out that's needed. Perhaps you've got to show that some question and there's a line missing. Misread, and we'll talk about those a bit later, but sometimes we give marks if somebody has misread the question, and you're indicating there. Rounded or truncated, seen or implied, without wrong working. Sometimes we might give credit for something if somebody's done correct working, but it hasn't quite shown what we want, but it is without wrong working. Correct solution only. I've already mentioned the other notation for dependent marks, and that's sometimes that little kind of C shape is a way of showing that. And anything in the mark scheme which is in square brackets is not required for the mark to be earned, but if it's present, it must be correct. Okay, so those are some added things you might see, but they are rarer than the previous slide I put there. So, I mean, the most important thing is examiners should mark according to the mark scheme. Every single set of examining papers that I get, usually I feel there is some sense of injustice somewhere. Usually a student has tried really, really hard and they don't get any marks. But quite often it's actually the opposite. Sometimes somebody has actually not done as they're told, they've got it wrong, or they've not done what I've asked them to in class, but somehow the mark scheme gives them full marks. But it's not about doing what we think is right. It's about following the mark scheme, and that's the kind of key. And the person who's in charge of that mark scheme for that particular paper, whoever they may be, is the person to discuss with that if the mark scheme needs changing, so that it can be consistent for everyone. But we mustn't ever kind of make decisions for ourselves on these things. So all candidates must receive the same treatment. Examiners must mark the last candidate in exactly the same way as they mark the first. It's kind of obvious, but sometimes it's hard to maintain that in how we do it. We think about how we mark sometimes. Some departments have somebody mark an entire paper for the whole department, just so that it's consistent. Every paper is done exactly the same. That makes moderation far easier. Within my own department, we usually decide that we're not. We mark our own papers and we moderate, and we spend a lot of time doing that. And the reason is that it helps us to know the misconceptions our own class has. And those two things need to be weighed up. A little bit perhaps comes on the preference of the teachers, or the desire to get consistent information. This year we might change that. We might all mark an individual paper. We might in fact mark a paper that we don't actually have a class of, just to make sure that there's no personal bias or no personal feelings there. But what I think personally probably affects me more is whether I do question by question, or whether I do groups of questions or even a whole paper, first, often for homeworks, especially if students largely are getting it right, I sometimes just go through the whole paper for a student and mark it. And then I kind of feel I can give feedback to that student that's really, really useful. I would have thought, though, the way that I mark those questions will differ quite greatly between the first student and the last student. Sometimes I might just be more tired at the end of the marking slot. But a way that you can make your marking more consistent is just by doing all of question 1, all of question 2, all of question 3. And that way you never have to kind of start going back and fishing out papers from before. But all candidates must receive the same treatment. Okay, the last one must have the same way, and we need to do whatever we need to do to make sure that that happens. Sometimes we should be prepared to award 0 marks, and sometimes it's heartbreaking when we're giving back somebody some work and we know that they've not got what we feel they would like to have. But if we're marking consistently, and consistency here is the key, we need to do that, and we can moderate our verbal feedback or the way we give the paper back in a way that that communicates and is perhaps more sensitive. But if a student doesn't deserve to get the marks by the mark scheme, they should not get them. So sometimes students make several attempts at an answer, and those are sometimes the hardest things to mark. So there's a little bit, and I have, and again, apologise, there's quite a few words on the page now, but I wanted to kind of really put it out. So where the candidate indicates what attempt they wanted to mark, the marker should honour this. Okay, so sometimes they will point to it and say, mark this, or this is my answer. We have the convention in our school, they often underline their answer. They do that in their books, and they often do that in papers, and that's quite useful because it puts an indication. Okay, they don't necessarily have to cross out the other one for you to still do that, but if they say that, you mark that one. The marker should mark the work that leads to an answer on the answer line. So if the student's written an answer on the answer line, but then they've got 2 separate methods, you should be marking the one that leads towards that. And finally, if there is no answer on the answer line, you should mark all methods and award the one with the lowest number of marks. That's the only fair way of doing it. So they don't necessarily get 0, but quite often that will be 0 because you can't be putting down more than one answer to a question. So crossed out work should be marked unless the candidate has replaced it with an alternative. So it's a good idea from very early on in the school to not encourage students to use correction fluid or to scribble out answers in their books. They often do that so that you can't read what's underneath. But from year 7 onwards, students really, if they cross work out, should be with a single line and a pencil, so you can see clearly what has been crossed out. That process of redoing things that are wrong as well is quite important, rather than trying to write over it, because that becomes quite messy and it becomes a nasty habit. If you've got a number that's wrong, and because it's wrong you perhaps try and write the next number on top of it. So those are habits that if you penalise very early on in the school, students get out of the habits of doing. It's also probably a worthwhile time, and maybe this is marking harsher than an exam board would do, who are generally looking for intent rather than there. But if students poorly form their numbers, 4s and 9s, 6s and 0s, 1s and 7s, so that they're confusing, it would be better to penalise the students in earlier years and to explain why they can't get marks for that, with the hope that in latter years they make those. Obviously, there are strong cases for those students who perhaps have SEN or need a scribe, that they wouldn't fall under those categories, but that's somewhere where you may deviate from a GCSE mark scheme a little bit. But crossed out work should be marked unless it's been kind of replaced with an alternative response. So This is sometimes quite a surprising one, but it is possible for the student to have the wrong answer written down and to still get lots and lots of marks through their work, even full marks sometimes if they've clearly written down an equation and solved the equation correctly and it's clearly there, and then they miswrite their answer to the answer line. There is an argument for saying that they should get full marks because they have done a correct solution fully, and that can be ticked. But there is some differing and conflicting things in exam boards about that, so that's where you need to have a consistent approach. But quite often, say in angle problems, students may write the angles that they're finding on the diagram, and you have to hunt for those things, and sometimes you see the exact one that it's asking you to find, but the student just hasn't transcribed it where they should. So it is there, and again, this is a quote from an exam board: if there is a wrong answer or no answer indicated on the answer line, always check that the working in the body of the script and or any diagrams, the student may even get full marks still. So that's an interesting one. Follow through marks. So follow through marks which have a single stage calculation can be awarded without working, as you can check the answer. So if it's just one stage, so that's perhaps a simple equation like 3x is equal to 6. But if it's ambiguous, the exam board I'm quoting here says do not award it. Follow-through marks which involve more than one stage of calculation can only be awarded on sight of the relevant working, even if it appears obvious that there is only one way you could get the answer given. And sometimes that might be two-stage equations or something like that, because it's ambiguous. So I probably always err on caution to not give those marks. But again, the person who's marking the paper, or the person who's moderating the paper, probably holds the opinion here. I'll give an example where I'm perhaps more likely to err on caution. So if we're trying to get the student to find the equation of a perpendicular bisector, we're given 2 points, A and B, and they make a mistake on the initial gradient, just a silly mistake. So they find the gradient of AB and it's wrong. So the next thing they need to do is to find the gradient of the perpendicular, and the next thing is to find the equation of the line through the midpoint, which has that perpendicular gradient, and everything will be wrong. Now, I would be inclined, if they do clear writing, like gradient of AB equals, gradient of perpendicular equals, to be perhaps a lot more sympathetic here to follow through marks. Whereas if they're just writing down, I don't know, gradient, or even M is this, M is that, they often do that for gradient, and I certainly wouldn't be awarding marks there as follow through marks, because it's quite unclear what those numbers are. So good written communication should support follow through marks more so, in my opinion. But I think in the examiner advice as well, that organisation does come as benefiting students. So sometimes on a mark scheme you will see a little asterisk like that. That means the answer's printed on the paper. It could be a question that says show that or prove that, and obviously for those questions you need to mark very, very carefully, and it is likely that unless the mark scheme is very, very clear of what the marks are for, you will need to talk to the person who's moderating the paper in advance. Obviously the answer's there, so every step of the proof needs to be crystal clear. One of those might be to prove that a recurring decimal and is a particular fraction. It often says prove that. So you need those steps to be key, and whether they times 1 by 10, 1 by 100, and then they subtract, and how you consistently as a department want those to be shown needs to be crystal clear. For my department, for those questions, we label the equations 1 and 2, and we subtract 1, take away 2, to make it really clear that that's the intent. Because then you've got to show that or prove that. That's slightly more rigorous. But again, that's down to the moderator in the department, and that should be on the mark scheme if it's going to be something that saves everyone. So again, full sentence solutions, this is perhaps a teaching point rather than a marking point to some degree, but say if we had a scatter graph and we wanted to suggest how an increase in temperature could affect ice cream sales. If we answered that question, the scatter graph suggests that an increase in temperature could mean more ice creams were sold. Notice here I've reworded the question into the answer. Okay, and that would certainly give you full marks for that. And notice the word could wouldn't necessarily be in bold in the paper, but I put that. If somebody said they would sell more, I wouldn't give them any award for that. They've not followed my teacher instructions for saying reuse the question in an answer it in a full sentence, but they've also said something that's mathematically not correct. Correlation does not imply causation, so that's false. So those things and what you accept as a written solution should be there, but that can kind of quite often come out of trying to teach it earlier on and trying to make sure that they're used to rewriting or rephrasing questions in answers, and they give them the opportunity to do that. Ignore subsequent working. Quite often we've got questions where we get to a point and then we award full marks, and sometimes we can do things to mess that up. So it's appropriate to ignore subsequent working when the additional work does not change the answer in a way that's inappropriate for the question or its context. So an example of that's an incorrectly cancelled fraction, or a fraction that's not been fully cancelled out. It's not appropriate to ignore subsequent work when the additional work essentially makes the answer incorrect. I've quoted exactly from a mark scheme there. An example of one there where it wouldn't be correct to do is if you had a quadratic equation x squared plus x, and then you simplified that to 2x squared. You've really shown that your use of algebra is poor, and that subsequent work will lose your answer marks. Even if the correct answer is seen earlier in the question, you would not get full marks for that. So if the exam says leave your answer in an exact form as well, subsequent workings as decimals should be penalised. So if you're leaving your answer in terms of pi, or leaving your answer where you should have surds in there, and the student decides to get a calculator out or to try and work it out, they would certainly lose that because they've shown that they do not understand what an exact form is. So there are examples where you can't ignore that, but for simple things to do with simplifying fractions or writing your fraction as a decimal, and sometimes people will do that wrong, and you're not penalised for it. So if you've got 2 quarters as your answer and you simplify it to a third, you wouldn't necessarily lose your mark. So if you've got a third and then you decide to work it out as a decimal as 0.3, which is wrong, you wouldn't necessarily need to, but I would still advise talking to the moderator. Again, what I've said, talk to the moderator a lot. When I often mark my papers, I write down the question numbers of the ones I'm not sure of while I'm marking, and then I see the moderator with them all, and then it just enables me to quickly do that, and I kind of bank that up. Or it's not a case of every time I see I stop marking and then move on and talk about that there. So there is a chance that students will get things right by using methods that are not in the mark scheme but are completely correct. Quite often at A-level, students who've done further maths use different methods, sometimes in sequences work. You might see that they use some A-level formula, but there might be other formulations. A good example perhaps is currencies. Sometimes if students do a comparison, they decide to take some random amount of money and convert it to the other currency for a comparison, and it's not an intuitive method. It wouldn't be on the mark scheme, but it still answers it correctly. But then what happens if they make a small mistake on that? Again, your team leader, the person marking that, would be the person that you would want to talk to. Probability answers. So there's no probability answers must always be given as a fraction, a percentage, or a decimal. Okay, either one is fine. Okay, ratios do not work for probability questions. If a candidate gives a decimal equivalent to a probability, this should be written to at least 2 decimal places, unless it's in tenths, obviously. Incorrect notation should lose accuracy marks, but be awarded any implied method marks. If a probability fraction is given, then cancelled incorrectly, ignore the incorrectly cancelled fraction. I encourage students to always simplify their fractions, even in probability questions. And I'm completely open if people disagree with me for that one, but I just think it's correct maths to do it. And you're not penalised if you get that wrong in the exam. But you do arguably waste time in probability questions, but there is no harm in students for probability questions at the end, not during the question, because you might have to add them at the end to simplify your fractions if you can, but you should communicate with students that they do not have to on probability questions. Again, 2/4, 2 out of 4, it seems so much more mathematically correct to say that's 1 out of 2. So if there's a question where a range of answers is accepted, it's given in the mark scheme, usually with a little dash. So it might say between 2.5 and 3.5, and we include those outer boundaries. That's how the rule of the mark scheme goes. I'm sometimes perhaps a little harsher in mark schemes that we write in school or what we accept. So say if it was a scatter graph or a cumulative frequency, I would expect those lines to go meeting the line of best fit and across, or to meet the cumulative frequency curve and move across, which actually show that that's the value that they're getting. So I do like to have that, but again, that's something that you would need to discuss with your moderator. Do you just accept somebody looking at a scatter graph and picking off a value, and if it's in that range, or if it's you just accept it, and if it's not, or do you want to see that process going up carefully, going along carefully? So that's there. I'd also put perhaps a little bit of warning here that if students have had enlarged papers due to SEN, then the person who's managing the mark scheme should prepare an appropriate set of answers for the person marking it, bearing in mind that that's caused a problem. And while I'm mentioning the whole principle of enlarged answers, or answers being slightly different, even the process of photocopying papers, going through a printer and then photocopying, sometimes that changes that range of values. So if you're using a GCSE mark scheme, questions like that may be slightly out and may need adapting. So it's worth just bearing that in mind. I have before gone through and marked a whole question, and the photocopying machine had shrank it all slightly, and I was wondering why my class had done so badly at the measuring. I had to go through and repeat all of that. So that saves time in advance. If you just, for questions on that paper, just measure them and make sure that the mark scheme is correct in advance. So misreading and miscopying. So it is quite common that a student will read some of the question, and then they will sometimes have read it wrong or picked out a wrong value, or sometimes with dyslexic students they might swap numbers around, and then they will continue the question, and they may continue the question fully correctly, but they've just misread the question, and it's obvious. So for misreading, which does not alter the character of the question or materially simplify it, deduct 2 from any A or B marks gained in that part of the question affected. So for a misread, you should only ever lose 2 marks at maximum. And that was from one exam board. Another exam board, and I'll read that one out as well, for a genuine misreading of the numbers or symbols, which is such that the object and the difficulty of the question remain unaltered, mark according to the mark scheme, but follow through from the candidate's data, a penalty mark is applied. 1 mark is generally appropriate, though this may differ for some units. This is achieved with holding 1 A mark from the question. So we've got 2 different exam boards there which give slightly different bits of advice, but generally speaking, and this is a theme for any paper really, care should be taken in mark schemes to see that a slip does not attract an excessive penalty. So if you've got a 6-mark question and somebody makes a slip earlier or misreads it earlier, it is unfair for them to lose 6 marks. But this is quoting an exam board. Nevertheless, high grades cannot be achieved on method marks alone, and accuracy is essential for the award of higher grades. So there's some food for thought there. There's also some clarification here that a misread is not the same as a miscopy. Okay, sometimes students have sloppy handwriting, which I've already said about. They have a 6, which looks like a 0, or a 1 that looks like a 7, or a 9 that looks like a 4, and they go from one line to the next line and they've miscopied it down and their answer is wrong. Miscopying, perhaps slightly more acceptably at A level, students turn over the page because they're writing longer answers and they don't transcribe it correctly. A miscopy of a candidate's own working is not a misread, but an accuracy error, and it should be treated as an accuracy error. So it's a little clarification. I've just put those thoughts on that slide there because there was some conflicting things, and I've put all that together in case anyone would like to keep that for reference. So this isn't really a bit from the exam board, but these are some different things that I've seen in members of staff I've worked with and people I've spoken to. So some people will go through a paper and do ticks and crosses. Okay, and students understand ticks and crosses really, really well. And if the main purpose of our marking is to communicate things with students, then that's perhaps not such a bad thing. Some schools actually don't do crosses, they do dots. Apparently crosses can upset students or be intimidating. And again, if that's your school, you keep in line with your procedures. Again, consistency might be something that you talk about. Some people, when they're marking exam papers, circle the number of marks by the question. So they either circle the bottom of the question, say how many marks they got, or they write underneath it if it's less than full marks. Okay, that's a very quick way, but then there's no ticks. It's just a case of that's how they've marked the paper. I've seen people mark and deduct marks from a paper. I've done it myself, I will admit to it. If a student is generally likely to get almost all the paper correct, and I know that that's true, I will tick it as it goes through, and say if they've lost 2 marks on the whole paper, I will write down on the question the -2 to signify to them where they've lost the marks. Mark schemes are meant to be marked in a positive way, and if you are putting negative things throughout the whole paper, that wouldn't be a positive way. It wouldn't be in the spirit of a mark scheme, but it does sometimes save time, and I've used it myself for high ability groups where there are not lots of mistakes, and it is a quick way of marking. Quite often if I'm marking papers for homework, that might be one. Some departments want the staff to mark using very clearly to say where every mark has come from. So if it's a 3-mark question and they've got the second method mark, perhaps that's independent for the first, they would write M0, M1, A0, or if there are 2 B marks there and they're clearly there, they would write that down. And that's really useful if you're trying to moderate to see where somebody's got the marks from. I would say that it is a very lengthy process, and it will take a marker much longer to do that, and they would need time to do it, and I think that's something there. Should you write comments on the paper as you're going through? If it's a year 11 mock paper, my answer to that, my personal opinion, is yes. If students have got things wrong and you want them to learn from it, that's still the most important thing. But again, having a consistency within your department might be something you do. And then is it red pen or green pen? Some schools are quite clear that certain colours are used for certain purposes. I'm not going to kind of try and sell any of those as being good or bad practice, but I think it's something to think about. From people that I work with, if somebody is already used to doing something in a particular way, I wouldn't try and change that for the sake of consistency, because I think that would affect their their ability to mark and to mark quickly and effectively. But those are things to think about, and perhaps as a newly qualified teacher, you might want to discuss some of those things with your head of department. The examiner advice is currently that students write down the formula that they're attempting to use, as this provides evidence of the correct method. That's something you may want to bear in mind when giving students method marks. Have they quoted the formula they're using? If they've not, then you might want to think twice about giving those. Again, that's consistency within your department. I know for some topics, like speed is equal to average speed is total distance travelled over total time taken. You might not necessarily put that in the formula, you might put the numbers in immediately, but the exam board has given its advice, and we should communicate that to students. Some kind of additional things here is it says students should give answers to the required accuracy, but to avoid rounding anything off until you get to your final answer. So that's come straight from the exam board. They should avoid rounding until the very final answer. Failure to round may or may not lose marks. That's quite an interesting one. So even if it says they need to round the answer, give your answer it doesn't always mean they lose marks. Sometimes there'll just be one rounding mark on a paper, and students will essentially have the wrong answer there because they've not done as they've been told, but you'd need to give them full marks, and that's something that you need to make sure is correct in the mark scheme beforehand, and the person moderating the paper needs to make a decision on that. Some kind of additional personal feelings to some degree on this. For most calculator questions, for high ability students in particular, calculators should be used only at the last stage. Okay, there are very rare circumstances where actually you've got lots of answers and you need to just write them down. But generally speaking, I think as a teacher, and I try and encourage my team to wait before they use their calculator to the very last stage and put it all in one go, because all the other marks up till then really are gained, and it's just that final mark, and putting something in and then putting your calculator down and writing, so it creates chaos for students. So we also have a policy in my school that when using a calculator, the students should write the truncated answer to 5 or more significant figures as the penultimate line. They shouldn't look at their calculator and then round what's on their calculator and write that down, because if they would get full marks for the unrounded version, which often they do, but they round it incorrectly, and everyone makes mistakes, then they're losing a needless mark. So as the penultimate line, they write the unrounded answer truncated to about 5, so they just write their calculator display or the first bit of it, and then in the last line they round it, and then they think of their accuracy and they write that by it, like 3 significant figures. And they kind of go back to the question, 3 significant figures is usually appropriate. There are cases at A level where, especially if G is used, gravity is 9.8, it should be to 2 significant figures, but 3 is accepted. And there are some questions where answers should be given. So again, if G is used and you've got a 19.6 divide by 9.8, you'd get the answer 2, but you should write 2.0. So there are cases where that differs, but generally speaking, 3 significant figures if it's a rounded solution. Students should be aware, and we should be aware when we're marking papers about what's been asked for. Generally, if it says write down or state, a method isn't needed. Those are 1-mark questions. But words like calculate, find, determine, show, solve, deduce, prove, the method is very, very important. If it says explain, discuss, compare, full sentences, and students at some point should be kind of given the mentoring on exam papers to know that how the question is worded should give an indication of what kind of thing is going to be expected. And if you've communicated that, in my opinion, when you're marking a paper, if students fail to do that, you're well within your rights to withhold the marks if that's consistent with your departmental policy and the mark scheme that you're using. Again, making the difference between draw and construct. and sketch. What's needed for those, and students should be aware, but you often see the word sketch and students are measuring points out, and it just doesn't need to be done like that. But being clear on that with the students benefits them and also helps you when you're marking to know what's being looked for. So I'm going to go through here a few say problems, but they're things to be aware of, more so when you're setting papers or things that are easily forgotten. So SEN students with additional time allowances, often if there's a whole school process for exams, that's quite easily, that's part of the kind of school procedure. But if it's something that's been done within mathematics lessons, then as a department that needs to be arranged for, perhaps in liaison with the SENCO, the enlargement of scripts for students where that's needed. And again, there are implications there on the mark scheme, where whoever's moderating the papers and kind of overseeing that needs to think about that. And then students who are entitled to readers, and again, if it's a school set of exams, those are often done on a school level, but if it's just being done within lessons, you might need to find more creative solutions for that. I often get every year when we have Year 11 mock exams, some students who somehow manage to see the papers. Quite often because we use papers that have been used in previous years, or their previous exam papers. So if I get, for instance, a student who's getting in the 80s and 90s and I'm expecting them to get in the 40s, that's a sign that they might have cheated, and in that case I can't use that information. I need to use some other assessment data, which I'm quite happy to use. I may or may not share with them that I am using that data. Sometimes you can't prove a student has taught, but you use all the evidence that you've got to create assessment information. Sometimes a student might in paper 1 get, say, 35, and then in paper 2 and 3 get 95. And again, that's a nice indication that there might be something that's unexpected going on here, and you sometimes see the first 2 papers are low, and then finally they kind of reach the idea that these are papers that they can find, and the final paper goes up, and perhaps finding an average for just the first 2 papers, or looking at kind of as I suppose a percentage score for the first 2 papers, where they lie in the cohort, to predict what the score should have been for the final paper. Something that I do, I always for mock exams switch paper 2 and 3, because they're both calculated papers. They can be done in any order. So sometimes if a student knows what paper 1 is, they might prepare paper 2 and actually they get paper 3, which I feel at least gives me 2 good papers. Obviously, increasingly using shadow papers is a good idea. Other problems, which again, they're not major problems here, but these are things that we discuss as a department and we kind of agree. It says at the front, use black ink or ballpoint pen. That's because in real exams, they are scanned and examiners mark them over a computer. So do we accept students who start writing in pencil or change to pink pen or something like that? And generally speaking, within my department, we don't. We would not give them the marks for that on the initial thing, and they would have a meeting with me where in the end I would explain to them that we will give them the benefit of the doubt this time, but it says clearly use black ink or ballpoint pen because that's what's scanned by a computer. In a similar way, there is an area of the paper that is scanned and the outside, and it says do not write here, but there's always some students who don't fit their answer quite in the space and they end up going outside there, and I think it's important to pick up on those things very early, because students do that in their real papers, and if they've got away with it in the past, they will not get away with it then. So those are things that you may want to consider or you may want to talk to classes about. Coming to some overall things. Now, some schools look at current grades as being very, very important, and some schools look at projected grades as being very, very important. And I don't want to argue the case for either way. Most schools actually, to some degree, look at both. My department always look at projected grades. So right the way, say in year 9, we are still projecting what they're likely to get at GCSE, and we're very interested in that because it enables us to compare that with the students' targets. But to kind of talk about that a little bit more, current grade, what would they get if they sat their GCSEs today? And then poses the question, why is that information important? In my opinion, it often isn't important, but it is something that you can work out. So and even with that being said, there are lots of things that can bias the paper a little bit. So some of them, as I've said, students cheating, but also we often teach things from papers that we've seen in the past. So sometimes that current grade is actually a little bit more biased than we like to give it credit for. And obviously, if you don't use the mark scheme exactly, which we don't exactly, we sometimes make small deviations from it. Maybe you substitute some questions that you've not covered yet, then the current grade really doesn't mean that much. And we've got a lot of compromise. But this projection, I'm very interested in for my department, because the senior leaders want to know exactly how we think students are going to do. And we know that they're on a trajectory, and we can still monitor that trajectory over the years. And it helps us to see how they're going to perform against the target. So that's very important for us. So on grading papers, it's obviously best to use the mark schemes and the grade boundaries that are there. Okay, that doesn't always happen though. So does missing out topics not yet covered make a big difference on the boundaries? I'll leave that as a food for thought. Is it better to substitute them or just leaving them out? We look very carefully at the distribution of grades. I look at that very, very carefully. I'm expecting a particular distribution, and if the distribution that comes from a paper doesn't follow that, it should raise questions. I will compare that distribution with the previous year's distribution if they've sat the same paper, or especially previous cohorts. And the last data capture, it would be wrong to report a year group a certain set of grades and then in the next data capture to say on average they've all gone up 2 sub-levels over one reporting window. It's just not going to happen. One of them is wrong, and things like that should be looked at to make sure that the data is consistent. So previous cohorts are really good. We tend to use the same exams for a few years so that you can make those and you can make sure that the grade boundaries used to produce a current and a projection are quite good. I'm not a very big fan of creating grades or creating current grades from APP style grids and saying this is an A grade question, this is a B grade question, and to measure them up. I never have found they give me an accurate distribution. Sometimes a Pythagoras question, for instance, which you might have got down to be a particular grade, can turn out to be really challenging to students, and sometimes it can be overtly easy. I'm going to share with you something that we do after year 11 mocks and end of year 10 exams in particular, and we look at the grades they get in their mocks, and that would be probably a current grade using a mark scheme that is very close to the GCSE one. And yes, there would be small deviations, as I've said lots of times. We would give them a grade based on that, and then look at their final grade that cohort got, and to see how much progress they've made. So you can see here that say our people who got grade 8s, 26 of them went up to grade 9, 66 stayed at 8, and 3 of them actually dropped. I believe this is over 3 years, so we've taken 3 years worth of people all sitting the same paper together and looked at that information. But that helps you make predictions on how the cohort's going to go and how the cohort's likely to achieve against their targets, and that's a really useful thing to do, and it doesn't take very long at all. but hopefully that helps the predictions and the projections to be more accurate, and to make sure that for the next cohort you get the distribution of grades is as you would expect and has gone through some kind of quality assurance. So I started off with this, and this is where I'm going to end. What is the purpose of assessment? Hopefully I've talked about lots of different purposes they could be used for, but that is the key. If it's just a piece of homework that's being marked, it would be marked very differently. But the key theme is consistency across the department, making sure everyone's doing it in a way that is completely transparent and gives the same results at the end, and the impact that has. And that's something I know I've not done justice to at all today, but there's very little point of spending all this time setting the exams, making all the students do the exams, and then marking all the papers, the teacher time that's taken up, if that's not going to be used for something that helps the students improve. Perhaps that's discussion for I started off by just making sure that it was really clear that this is not meant to give you advice on how to be an examiner. The purpose of this was not for that. I've put it down in words here. The purpose is to provide some CPD, especially for inexperienced markers they might find useful, and to pose some questions for middle leaders who might be setting exam papers. Okay, but it's a minor. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. If you want any additional things, do feel free to contact me. But it's been enjoyable. Bye-bye.